It was just an ordinary morning, or at least it seemed like one at the time. We'd moved into this neighborhood about a year ago, a quiet, almost sleepy place where everyone knew everyone else's business. The houses were old, with cracked paint and creaky floorboards that felt like they'd seen generations pass through. Our house was one of the few that didn't seem like it was falling apart, mostly thanks to my dad, who loved fixing things. I'd always liked the calm, the way the trees shaded the streets, the distant hum of lawnmowers on weekends. It was boring, but the good kind of boring, you know? Anyway, that morning started like any other. I was sitting at the kitchen table, half awake, spooning cereal into my mouth, when my sister, let's call her Sarah, came downstairs. She wasn't much of a morning person, so it surprised me when she came in all wide-eyed, like she'd seen a ghost or something. "Did you see them?" she asked, her voice hushed but intense. I frowned. "See who?" She pointed out the window, her fingers shaking slightly. Our kitchen faced the back of the house with a clear view of the neighbor's yard, which had been empty for months. No one had lived there for a while. It was one of those places that always felt a little off, like it was stuck in time or something, grass overgrown, shutters hanging crookedly, paint peeling off the walls. At night, I swear it looked like it was holding its breath. "There," she whispered, "the women." I leaned closer to the window, peering through the smudged glass. Sure enough, there they were. Two women sitting on an old, rusted bench in the neighbor's backyard. At first glance, they looked like they could have been anyone. They were dressed in these long, dark coats, even though it wasn't cold out, and their hair was tied back in neat buns. But there was something about them that felt wrong. Their posture was too stiff, too still, like mannequins almost. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck prickling as I watched them. They were talking to each other, but the sound didn't carry over. Their lips moved in quick, sharp motions like they were arguing, but there was no sound. And then I realized it wasn't English. It wasn't any language I'd ever heard before. It was guttural, almost like, I don't know, like whispers from another world. Sarah was gripping the edge of the counter now, her knuckles white. "What are they saying?" I shook my head. "I don't know, I can't hear them." She stared at them for a few more seconds, her face pale, before muttering, "I'm going out there." "Wait," I said, but she was already halfway to the back door. Sarah could be stubborn like that, always needing to know what was going on, always needing to push boundaries. Me? I was more of the let's not poke the hornet's nest type. I followed her to the door, heart thudding in my chest. As she stepped outside, the air hit us. It was cold, colder than it had any right to be for that time of day. The sun was up, but there was this strange bite in the wind, like it carried the chill of some distant, forgotten winter. Sarah walked slowly across the yard, her eyes fixed on the two women. They didn't seem to notice her at first, just kept talking in that weird, alien language. I stayed a few paces behind her, my stomach twisting into knots. Then she did something I never expected. She bent down, grabbed a small rock from the ground, and threw it towards them. Not hard, just enough to get their attention. The rock bounced off the ground near the bench, and for a second, everything went still. The women stopped talking. Their heads tilted slightly, like they were listening for something, like they were processing the sound of the rock hitting the dirt. And then they laughed, but it wasn't a normal laugh. It was this high-pitched, shrill giggling that made my skin crawl. It was like hearing nails scrape across a chalkboard, but worse. It was so wrong, so unnatural. It made me want to scream, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. Sarah took a step back, her face a mask of fear. "What the hell?" The women slowly turned their heads towards us, moving in this unnervingly synchronized way, like they were one being split in two. Their faces, God, their faces, were wrong. At first glance, they looked normal, but the closer I looked, the more I realized their features didn't quite fit together. Their eyes were too far apart, their smiles too wide, stretching impossibly across their faces. And those smiles, they weren't friendly. They were mocking, cruel, like they knew something we didn't, like they were enjoying some private joke at our expense. I wanted to run, to drag Sarah back to the house, but my legs wouldn't move. All I could do was stare as they sat there, smiling at us, their eyes cold and unblinking. Then, without warning, one of them stood up. Slowly, deliberately, she began walking towards us. Her movements were stiff, jerky, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Every step she took seemed to echo in the air, though the ground was soft beneath her feet. Sarah finally snapped out of it. She turned and bolted towards the house, nearly tripping over her own feet in her panic. I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my ears. We slammed the door shut behind us, locking it tight. "What the hell was that?" Sarah gasped, leaning against the door, her face pale as a sheet. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking, "but we need to get Dad." Our dad had always been the skeptical type, never one for ghost stories or the supernatural. But when we dragged him to the window to show him, the yard was empty. No women, no bench, nothing, just the same overgrown grass and cracked pavement. "They were right there," Sarah insisted, her voice high with frustration and fear. "You have to believe me." But there was nothing for him to see, and he just sighed, shaking his head. "You two need to stop watching horror movies before bed," he said, turning to head back to his workshop. "It's just your imagination." But it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. I could still feel the chill in the air, could still hear that awful laughter echoing in my head. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was watching me. I kept thinking about those women, about the way they'd moved, the way they'd smiled. Something about them felt unfinished. Like they weren't fully formed, like they were just wearing the shape of people, but something was missing beneath the surface. The next day, I woke up to find Sarah sitting by the window again, staring out at the empty yard. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and haunted. She didn't say anything when I asked her if she was okay, just shook her head and kept staring. A few days passed, and things seemed to go back to normal. The women didn't come back, at least not that we saw, but something had shifted. The air around our house felt heavier, like it was pressing in on us. At night, I started hearing things, whispers, faint and distant, like someone was talking just outside the window. But whenever I looked, there was no one there. And then one evening, it happened. I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom when I heard the giggling again. That same awful, shrill laughter. It was coming from downstairs, from the kitchen. I froze, toothbrush still in my mouth, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I crept down the stairs, gripping the banister like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw them. The two women were sitting at our kitchen table, facing the window. Their backs were to me, but I knew it was them. I could feel the cold radiating off them, could hear their voices, low and whispering in that same strange guttural language. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, standing there in the doorway, watching as they talked and laughed like they belonged there, like they were part of our house now. And then, as if they sensed me, they stopped. Slowly, ever so slowly, they turned their heads towards me, their faces twisted into those same cruel smiles. But this time, they didn't just laugh. This time, they spoke. "Come closer," one of them whispered, her voice echoing in my mind, though her lips barely moved. "We've been waiting for you." I didn't stay to find out what they meant. I ran, bolting back upstairs, locking myself in my room. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. And the worst part? When I told Sarah the next morning, she just smiled. That same wide, too big smile. "They're not gone," she whispered, her voice eerily calm. "They're just waiting. I don't know what they want, but I can feel them. Every night they're there, outside the window, just waiting." I didn't know what to do after that. Every time I looked at Sarah, it felt like I was looking at a stranger. She still looked like my sister, sounded like her, but there was this distance in her eyes, this coldness that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just me who noticed it either. Dad kept making these offhand comments, asking if Sarah was feeling okay. She hadn't been eating much, hadn't been talking either, just sitting by the window, staring out into the neighbor's yard. She was waiting for something. I tried to talk to her. I really did. A few days after that night, when I caught her sitting at the kitchen table again, I sat down across from her. The house was quiet, the kind of heavy silence that made every little sound feel too loud. "Sarah," I began cautiously, "what's going on with you?" She didn't look at me, just kept her eyes focused on the window. The light outside was fading, the sky turning that eerie purple just before it slips into night. They want you too, she whispered so softly that I almost didn't hear it. What? Who? The women. She finally turned her head towards me, her eyes dark and hollow. They've been waiting. They know you saw them. A chill ran down my spine. You're not making any sense. Sarah, we have to tell someone. We have to get help. But she just shook her head slowly, that unnerving smile creeping back onto her face. It's too late. They're already here. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of laughter just outside the window. It was soft at first, but then it grew louder, that same high-pitched giggling that I had heard before. I felt my throat tighten, my heart racing as I glanced out the window. But there was nothing, just the empty, overgrown yard next door. But I knew they were there. I could feel them watching us. I can't do this anymore, I muttered, standing up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. I'm getting Dad. I turned and practically ran down the hallway to the garage, where Dad spent most of his evenings working on whatever project had caught his interest that week. The smell of oil and sawdust filled the air as I pushed open the door, finding him hunched over his workbench, fiddling with some old radio he was trying to restore. Dad, I said, my voice trembling, something's wrong with Sarah. He turned, looking at me with concern. What do you mean? Is she sick? I don't know. I think something's wrong with her. She's acting strange. She keeps talking about those women next door, the ones we saw. Dad frowned, wiping his hands on a rag. You're still on about that? There's no one next door. It's just an empty house. No, I insisted. They're real. We both saw them, and now she's saying they want me too. I swear, Dad, there's something going on. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Look, I'm sure she's just stressed, maybe scared after what happened, but there's no such thing as ghosts or whatever it is you think you saw. I'm not imagining it, I nearly shouted, the panic bubbling up inside me. They're real. You have to believe me. Dad just gave me that same skeptical look, the one that said he wasn't buying any of it. He'd always been the rational one, the one who needed proof, facts, and right now I didn't have any to give him. Just come inside, I pleaded. Come talk to her, please. With a reluctant sigh, he followed me back into the house. But when we reached the kitchen, Sarah was gone. Her chair was pushed back, her plate untouched, but she wasn't there. Sarah? Dad called out, walking through the house, checking the living room, her bedroom, even the bathroom. But she was nowhere to be found. Panic settled in my chest like a weight. I checked the back door, and sure enough, it was unlocked. She must have gone outside. Stay here, Dad said, grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. I'll go look for her. I didn't listen. I couldn't just stand there waiting. I grabbed my jacket and followed him outside, into the chilly night air. The wind had picked up, rustling through the trees, and the sky was dark now, the last traces of daylight swallowed by thick clouds. The yard next door looked even more eerie in the dark, the old house looming like a shadow. Dad moved ahead of me, his flashlight beam cutting through the night as he called out for Sarah. But there was no answer, just that thick, heavy silence. We reached the edge of the neighbor's yard, and that's when I saw it, the bench. It hadn't been there earlier, but now it was. Rusted, old, the same one the women had been sitting on, and just behind it, standing in the shadows, were the two figures. Dad, I whispered, grabbing his arm. They're here. He swung the flashlight beam over, and for a split second, the light caught them. Two women, standing perfectly still, just like before, but their faces, they were different. Their smiles were gone, replaced by something else, something darker. Their eyes glinted in the light, hollow and black, like deep pits that sucked in everything around them. Sarah? Dad called out, stepping forward. One of the women took a step closer, her head tilting unnaturally to the side. And then, in that same eerie, broken voice, she spoke. She's with us now. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, everything went dark. I felt my heart stop in my chest. When the light came back on, they were gone. The women, the bench, everything. It was as if they had never been there. Except Sarah. She was standing where the women had been, her back to us, her hair hanging limply around her shoulders. Dad rushed forward, grabbing her by the arm. Sarah, where the hell did you go? She turned slowly to face us, and my heart sank. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and that smile, the one that had been haunting me for days, stretched across her face. They're not gone, she whispered, her voice cold and empty. They'll never be gone. I stared at her, my mind racing. This wasn't Sarah. This wasn't my sister. Whatever had happened to her, she was different now. Dad was still talking to her, asking her questions, but she wasn't answering. She just stood there, smiling that awful, unnatural smile, her eyes fixed on the empty house next door. I knew then that whatever had come for Sarah, whatever had taken her, wasn't done yet, and I was next. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I kept hearing the whispers, the faint sound of giggling just outside the window. And every time I looked over, I saw them, two figures standing in the shadows, watching, waiting. They weren't gone. They were never gone. And I knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before they came for me too. It was one of those quiet, chilly nights in late October, the kind where the air bites at your skin and the wind carries an eerie sort of calm that makes everything feel just a little too still. The sky was overcast and the clouds hung low, reflecting the dull glow of the streetlights in our suburban neighborhood. I always found nights like that unsettling, but I tried not to let my imagination get the better of me. After all, I was just a single mom living on the outskirts of town with my son Ben and our dog Charlie. It wasn't like anything strange ever happened out here. But that night was different. It had been a long day. Between work and keeping up with Ben's school activities, I was exhausted. It was around 10 p.m., and I had just finished tucking Ben into bed. I was looking forward to curling up on the couch with a cup of tea and letting the stress of the day melt away. Charlie, our big, goofy golden retriever, had been out in the backyard for the last hour or so, running around the open field behind our house like he usually did. He loved it out there. Wide open spaces to chase squirrels, sniff around, and stretch his legs. It wasn't fenced in, but Charlie was good about staying close, and I'd always call him back before I went to bed. I stepped out onto the back porch, pulling my sweater tight around me as the cold air hit. I could see Charlie's shape darting back and forth in the dim light from the porch, his tail wagging as he sniffed at something in the grass. "Charlie," I called out, my voice echoing into the quiet night. "Time to come in, boy." He lifted his head, ears perked, but he didn't come running like he usually did. Instead, he froze, staring off into the darkness of the field just beyond where the light from the porch reached. His tail stopped wagging, and he let out this low, uneasy growl. I frowned, taking a step forward. "Charlie, come on." And then, from somewhere out in the dark, I heard it. A man's voice, calm, almost casual. "Charlie, here, boy." It was unmistakable. Someone was out there in the field calling my dog. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt this wave of cold dread wash over me. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew what I heard. There was no mistaking it. I called out again, louder this time, panic creeping into my voice. "Charlie, come here now!" Charlie hesitated for a moment, his ears flicking back and forth between me and the direction of the voice. Then, thankfully, he turned and trotted back toward the porch, his movements quick and tense. I grabbed him by the collar the second he reached me, pulling him inside and shutting the door behind us with a loud bang. I stood there for a moment, my hand still gripping Charlie's collar, my heart pounding in my chest. Who was out there? Why were they calling my dog? I glanced out the window, but all I could see was the field, bathed in the dim light of the porch. Nothing moved. It was quiet again, too quiet, except for the wind that rustled through the tall grass. I locked the back door, making sure the deadbolt was secure, and double-checked all the other windows in the house, pulling the curtains closed. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one worse than the last. We didn't live in a bad area, but this wasn't the kind of thing that happened here. The neighbors were miles away, and we rarely saw anyone out by the field, especially not at night. Maybe it was some stupid prank, some kids messing around trying to freak me out, but it hadn't sounded like a kid. The voice had been deep, steady, too calm, almost like whoever it was expected Charlie to come. I tried to shake the feeling and headed into the living room, pulling my phone from my pocket. I figured I'd call the police, just in case, report it as a suspicious person. But before I could even dial, I heard it, this loud, thudding noise from the garage. I froze. The garage was attached to the house just off the kitchen, and we hardly ever used it for the car. It was more of a storage space, filled with boxes, old tools, and stuff I hadn't gotten around to organizing yet. The door to it was locked, and I hadn't opened it in hours. No one should have been in there. But there it was again, another loud bang, like something heavy being dropped. My throat tightened, and I felt the pulse in my neck pounding as fear crept through me. Charlie barked once, low and nervous, his ears pinned back. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was in the garage. I glanced around the kitchen for something, anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes landed on a kitchen knife sitting in the drying rack, and I grabbed it, clutching it tightly as I moved toward the door leading to the garage. I pressed my ear against it, listening, my breath shaky and shallow. There was a shuffling sound now, like someone moving around in there. Slow, deliberate. I could almost hear them breathing. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to grab Ben and lock ourselves in a room until the police came. But I had to know. I had to see who was in my house. I couldn't just stand there, waiting for them to come to us. With my hand trembling, I slowly unlocked the door and pulled it open just a crack. The garage was pitch black, and for a moment, all I could hear was the wind howling through a small gap in the side door that led outside. Then suddenly, the motion sensor light in the garage flickered on. I gasped. Standing in the corner of the garage, half hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a man. His clothes were ragged, his hair matted and greasy, and his skin pale in the harsh light. He didn't seem startled by the light coming on. If anything, he looked like he had been expecting it. And then he smiled. It was the kind of smile that twisted my stomach into knots. Slow, deliberate, too wide for his face. His teeth were yellow, crooked, and there was something in his eyes that chilled me to the bone. Something dark, something dangerous. "Nice night, isn't it?" he said softly, his voice the same one I'd heard out in the field. I slammed the door shut so hard the walls shook, twisting the lock with shaking hands and backing away as fast as I could. My mind raced. What the hell was he doing in my garage? How had he gotten in? And why was he calling for my dog? Charlie was growling now, pacing nervously near the kitchen, sensing my fear. I grabbed my phone again, dialing 911 with trembling fingers, praying the operator would pick up quickly. 911, what's your emergency? Came the calm voice on the other end of the line. There's someone in my garage, I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know how he got in, but he's in there now. Please, you need to send someone. Ma'am, stay calm, the operator said. Officers are on their way. Stay on the line with me and make sure all your doors and windows are locked. I barely heard her over the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I backed away from the kitchen door, gripping the knife in one hand, the phone in the other. I felt like a trapped animal, waiting for the moment that man would try to force his way into the house. And then, just when I thought the nightmare couldn't get any worse, I heard the garage door open. Not the one inside the house, the one outside. The heavy creaking sound of the old mechanical door being lifted. I hadn't even realized it was unlocked. I rushed to the nearest window and peeked through the curtains, just in time to see the man walking out into the driveway. He didn't run, didn't look back. He just strolled away, disappearing into the darkness like he hadn't just broken into my house, like he hadn't just called my dog from the shadows. I stayed frozen in place until the police arrived, their flashing lights casting blue and red streaks across the front lawn. I told them everything, about the voice in the field, the man in the garage, the way he smiled at me like he knew something I didn't. The officers searched the property, but they didn't find anything. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. It was like he had never been there at all. One of the officers, a tall, stocky guy with a no-nonsense attitude, tried to reassure me. It's probably just some drifter, he said. Maybe he was looking for a place to sleep, but if he comes back, you call us, all right? I nodded, but I didn't feel reassured. I felt cold, shaken to my core. It wasn't just the fact that someone had been in my house. It was the way he had called for Charlie, the way he smiled at me like he knew something I didn't. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch, clutching Charlie's collar, my eyes glued to the windows, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The night passed in eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind against the house. Days went by, and the memory of that night started to fade, though I never truly shook the feeling that I was being watched. I changed the locks on the doors, put up new security cameras, and made sure Ben never went outside alone. But every time I stepped outside, every time I let Charlie into the backyard, I felt that cold dread creeping up on me again. It wasn't until a week later that I found the note. I was cleaning out the garage, trying to get rid of the clutter and make sure there weren't any hidden places for someone to hide. I was moving a stack of old newspapers when I saw it, a small, folded piece of paper tucked between two boxes. My hands shook as I opened it, the words scrawled in messy, uneven handwriting. "You called him back. I'll be waiting for you next." My stomach dropped. I haven't let Charlie out of my sight since. And every night, I lock the doors, pull the curtains closed, and listen for the voice in the dark. After I found that note, something inside me snapped. The air in my own home felt different, heavier, suffocating almost. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a feeling of being trapped, like no matter how much I locked the doors, changed the locks, or checked the windows, it wasn't enough. He was still out there, watching, waiting. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house felt too loud, every gust of wind made me jump. I sat in bed, staring at the door, trying to keep my breath steady. Charlie slept at the foot of the bed, but even he seemed restless. Every now and then his ears would twitch, his head would pop up, and he'd stare towards the window, letting out a soft growl before eventually lying back down. But I couldn't relax. I couldn't let my guard down. Ben. My thoughts kept circling back to my son, sleeping peacefully in the next room. He didn't know. He had no idea about the note, about what had happened. I had kept it from him, not wanting to scare him. But now I wasn't sure if I'd made the right choice. What if that man came back? What if next time it wasn't just Charlie he called for? The next morning I made up my mind. I couldn't stay here, not with Ben, not with Charlie, not until I knew it was safe. I'd go stay with my sister for a while. Her house was only about 30 minutes away, close enough to keep up with work and school, but far enough that I'd feel like we had some space from all of this. I could make up some excuse for Ben, tell him we were visiting for a bit. He didn't need to know the real reason, not yet. I spent most of the day packing, keeping myself busy to drown out the growing anxiety gnawing at the back of my mind. Charlie followed me from room to room, his usual happy energy dampened, as if he sensed my tension. I caught him staring out the window more than once, his eyes fixed on the field in the back. I was almost done packing when Ben wandered into the living room, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Mom, where are we going?" he asked, glancing at the suitcases I had lined up by the door. "Just going to stay with Aunt Karen for a few days," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "I thought it'd be fun to visit her, you know? Get out of the house for a bit." He looked at me for a second, his young face serious. "Are we in trouble?" I blinked, caught off guard. "No, honey, of course not. Why would you think that?" He shrugged. "I don't know. You've been acting weird." I forced a smile, reaching out to ruffle his hair. "I'm just tired, that's all. We'll have fun at Aunt Karen's, okay?" He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. Still, he didn't press me further. I was grateful for that. By the time evening rolled around, we were almost ready to leave. I had packed up the car, triple-checked the doors and windows, and made sure to grab all the essentials. I'd already let Karen know we were coming, and she'd been more than happy to have us stay for a while. Ben was upstairs grabbing his last-minute things, and I was in the kitchen, filling Charlie's bowl for the road when it happened. The voice. It was the same voice I had heard that night, deep, calm, almost too casual, and this time it was calling my name. "Emily." I froze, the bowl slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the back door. I couldn't see anything outside through the curtains, but I knew he was out there. "Emily." The voice came again, closer this time, like he was just outside the door, inches away. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone from the counter, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I couldn't move, couldn't think straight. The only thing going through my mind was the realization that he had said my name. Not Charlie's, mine. Suddenly, I heard the sound of claws scratching against the wood floor. I turned and saw Charlie, his fur bristling, his body tense as he growled low in his throat. He was staring at the back door, his teeth bared, a deep guttural growl vibrating from his chest. Then a knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the back door. I stepped back, fear crawling up my spine like ice water. I couldn't open that door. I wouldn't. But whoever was on the other side wasn't going away. "Emily, why don't you come out here?" The voice was soft, almost like a taunt. It made my skin crawl. My grip tightened on the phone, and without thinking, I dialed 911 again, just like before. The operator answered quickly, but I could barely speak. My voice was shaking, and all I could say was, "He's back. He's at my door." "Ma'am, stay calm," the operator said, her voice steady. "Officers are on their way. Is your door locked?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yes, it's locked. Stay inside. Don't open the door for anyone." Another knock, this time louder, more forceful. Charlie's growling intensified, and I took another step back, keeping my eyes on the door. I don't know how long I stood there, gripping my phone like a lifeline, listening to the operator's calm voice as she reassured me that help was on the way. It could have been minutes or hours. Time felt distorted, stretched by the fear pulsing through me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The knocking, the voice, everything. The silence that followed was almost worse. It was so thick, so oppressive, I felt like I couldn't breathe. "Ma'am, are you still there?" the operator asked. I swallowed hard, glancing toward the door. Charlie had stopped growling, but he was still tense, his body rigid as he stared at the door, waiting. I crept closer to the window, just enough to peek through the curtains. Nothing. The field was empty, the backyard quiet. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, footsteps, rustling, anything, but there was only the wind. I think he's gone," I whispered into the phone, my voice barely audible. "Officers will be there shortly. Stay inside until they arrive," the operator instructed. I nodded, slowly backing away from the door and sinking into one of the kitchen chairs, my entire body trembling with adrenaline. Charlie finally relaxed a bit, coming over to sit next to me, his warm body pressing against my leg as if to comfort me. It felt like an eternity before the police arrived. 2 officers knocked on the front door, and I let them in, explaining everything that had happened. Again. They searched the property, walked the perimeter, but just like the last time, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. Nothing. "It's possible someone's been watching your routine," one of the officers said. "They know when you're home, when your dog's outside. Could be a drifter, like before. But we'll keep an eye on the area, ma'am. If you hear or see anything else, don't hesitate to call." I thanked them, but their words didn't reassure me. I knew what I had heard. He had been here, right outside my door, calling my name. As the officers left, I stood in the doorway, watching their patrol car drive off into the night. The house felt too quiet, too empty now. I turned to Charlie, who was sitting by the door, his eyes still focused on the backyard. "We're leaving first thing tomorrow," I whispered to him, more to myself than to him. "We're not staying here." And we didn't. The next morning, I packed Ben and Charlie into the car, and we drove to Karen's house. I told Ben we were going to stay for a while, that it was a mini vacation of sorts. He seemed excited, unaware of the fear that gnawed at me from the inside. I hadn't told Karen the full story yet, just enough to explain why I needed to get away for a bit. I still can't explain what happened, even now, months later. Every time I try to make sense of it, it feels like the details slip through my fingers, as if my mind refuses to fully understand. But I'll try to tell you, even if I don't know if I'll ever really understand it myself. It started not long after we moved into that quiet neighborhood. I'm 28, and my partner Jake works nights as a security guard. That meant I spent a lot of time at home by myself, especially in the evenings. We'd just bought this small house in a cozy little suburb, one of those places where every house looks the same, and the neighbors wave at you every time they see you. It was supposed to be perfect, or at least that's what we thought when we first moved in. The house itself was nice. Not new, but well kept. A small backyard, a couple of bedrooms, enough space for the 2 of us. But being alone there at night, it always felt off somehow. The house creaked more than I expected. The wind seemed to howl just a little too loudly through the trees in the backyard, and sometimes I swore I heard sounds I couldn't explain. but Jake would always brush it off as me being paranoid. "Old houses make noise," he'd say. "It's just settling, nothing to worry about." I tried to believe him. I really did. But when you're alone in a house like that, in the dead of night, those noises start to feel a lot less innocent. That's why I adopted the dog. I'd always wanted one anyway, but being home alone so often gave me the perfect excuse. Plus, I thought having a dog might make me feel safer, more grounded somehow. His name was Max, a scruffy little mutt I picked up from the shelter. He wasn't big, but he had a bark that could shake the walls, and I figured that was enough. Max was a good dog, loyal, energetic, and always ready to explore the neighborhood. And it was through him that I got to know some of the people who lived around us. There was Mrs. Kowalski, the elderly woman who lived 2 doors down, always sitting on her porch in the late afternoons. She'd wave whenever I walked by with Max and tell me about her cats, who apparently didn't take kindly to dogs. Then there was Rob, the middle-aged guy across the street who worked as a mechanic. He had this huge German Shepherd that Max loved to play with whenever we passed by. At first, things seemed normal. I was starting to settle into a routine, walking Max in the mornings, chatting with the neighbors, coming home to cook dinner before Jake left for work. But then things started to change. Little by little, I began to notice strange things around the house. It started small, as these things usually do. I'd come home from walking Max and find that a window I was sure I'd closed was now cracked open. Or I'd hear the faintest creak of a floorboard upstairs, even though I knew I was the only one home. At first, I convinced myself I was just being careless, that I was imagining things. But then there was the night I came home from my walk and found the back door wide open. Now, I knew I hadn't left it that way. I'm meticulous about locking the doors, especially with Jake gone all night. But when I saw that door swinging open, I felt this cold dread seep into my bones. Max didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. He trotted right past me into the house, as if everything was normal. But I stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the door, half expecting someone to step out of the shadows. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and tried to put it out of my mind. But that night, I hardly slept. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the house made me sit bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. Max slept soundly at the foot of the bed, blissfully unaware of my fear. The next morning, I went about my routine, trying to shake off the lingering unease. Max and I took our usual walk around the block, and that's when I ran into Mr. Kowalski. I hadn't met him before, only his wife, who always seemed so pleasant. He was standing by his fence, watching me as I approached with Max. There was something about the way he looked at me that sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't put my finger on why. "You've got yourself a fine dog there," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Thanks," I replied, trying to sound casual. "He's a good boy." Mr. Kowalski nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on Max for just a second too long. Then he smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was more like, I don't know, like he knew something I didn't. "You be careful around here," he said. "Strange things happen in this neighborhood." I didn't know how to respond to that. I just nodded awkwardly and continued on my way, but his words stuck with me. Strange things? What did he mean by that? I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just talking about a bad storm or a power outage. That night, Jake left for work like usual, and I was alone again. I tried to distract myself with TV, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound in the house seemed amplified, like the walls were closing in on me. Max lay curled up beside me, his head resting on my lap, his tail occasionally thumping against the couch. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, that there was nothing to be afraid of. Then, just after midnight, I heard something that I couldn't explain. It started as a faint tapping, like someone lightly knocking on the window in the living room. I muted the TV and held my breath, listening. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I glanced down at Max, but he hadn't reacted at all. He was fast asleep, completely unbothered. My heart was racing now. I stood up slowly, my eyes fixed on the window, half expecting to see someone standing outside. But when I pulled the curtain back, there was nothing. Just the dark, empty street. I exhaled shakily, trying to convince myself it had just been a tree branch or maybe a bird. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was no tree near that window, and the sound had been too deliberate, too human. The next few nights were worse. The tapping continued, always at the same time, just after midnight. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to set my nerves on edge. And it wasn't just the tapping. There were other sounds too. Soft whispers that seemed to come from the walls, the floorboards creaking like someone was walking through the house when I knew I was alone. I started leaving lights on in every room, hoping that would make me feel safer, but it didn't help. If anything, the shadows seemed darker, more threatening. Max, though, Max acted like nothing was wrong. He still greeted me with his usual enthusiasm when I came home, still curled up beside me every night, completely oblivious to the growing fear that gnawed at me. One night, after another bout of that damn tapping, I'd had enough. I grabbed a flashlight and stormed outside, determined to figure out what was going on. The neighborhood was deathly quiet, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. I walked around the house, shining the light into every corner, every shadow. But there was nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone, just the cold, empty night. As I turned to head back inside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the far side of the backyard, near the fence that separated our house from Mr. Kowalski's, there was a figure. It was dark, too far away to make out any details, but I knew someone was there. I could feel their eyes on me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest, and rushed back inside, slamming the door behind me. Max was there, wagging his tail as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the terror that gripped me. I locked every door, checked every window, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Whoever, or whatever, was out there could get in if they wanted to. That night, I barely slept. I kept expecting to hear the tapping again, or worse, to see that figure standing at the window, looking in at me. But the night passed without incident. The next morning, I decided I needed to talk to someone about it. I couldn't keep living like this, in constant fear. I thought about telling Jake, but he'd never believe me. He'd just brush it off like he always did. So instead, I went to see Mrs. Kowalski. She'd lived in the neighborhood for years. Maybe she knew something. Maybe she could help. I found her on her porch as usual, sipping tea and watching the world go by. "Good morning, dear," she said cheerfully. "What brings you by?" I hesitated, unsure of how to start. I've been hearing things, at night, tapping on the windows, whispers, and I saw someone in the backyard last night. Her smile faded, and she looked at me with a strange expression, one I couldn't quite place. Was it concern, or something else? "You're not the first, you know," she said after a moment, her voice quiet. "Strange things have happened in that house before. The couple who lived there before you, they left in a hurry. Never said why, but I always suspected something wasn't right." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What happened to them?" Mrs. Kowalski shook her head, her eyes distant. "I don't know for sure, but I think whatever's been happening to you happened to them too." I left her house feeling worse than before. Now I knew there was something wrong with the house, but I didn't know what, and that made it so much worse. I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every little sound, every creak of the floorboards. And that night, everything came to a head. It was just after midnight when I heard the tapping again. This time, though it wasn't coming from the window, it was coming from the front door. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and crept toward the door. Max followed close behind me, his tail low, his ears perked. I could see the outline of someone standing on the other side of the door, their shadow visible through the frosted glass. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer, just the tapping. Steady, rhythmic. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the doorknob. I didn't want to open it. I knew I shouldn't. But something inside me compelled me to do it, like I didn't have a choice. I twisted the knob and pulled the door open, bracing myself for whatever was on the other side. But there was no one there, just the empty street, bathed in the dim light of the street lamp. I stepped outside, looking around frantically, but the street was deserted. I was about to turn back inside when I saw it, a note tucked into the doorframe. I pulled it out with trembling hands and unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, almost illegible, but I could make out the words. "You're not alone. You've never been alone. My blood ran cold. I dropped the note, stumbling backward into the house, slamming the door shut behind me. Max let out a low whine, sensing my fear, but I couldn't calm down. I knew in that moment that whatever was happening wasn't over. After finding that note, I couldn't breathe. My entire body felt cold, like someone had turned off a switch inside me. I stood there gripping the doorknob so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced. What did the note mean? I've never been alone. I shut the door hard, making sure to lock it, double-checking, triple-checking. I even dragged a chair over and wedged it under the handle like I'd seen people do in movies. It wasn't like I thought that would really stop anyone or anything, but it made me feel like I was doing something. Max stood by me, his eyes wide, tail tucked between his legs. His unease only added to the fear gnawing at my insides. I stumbled back into the living room, my heart still pounding. I could feel my pulse in my ears, loud and rhythmic, drowning out all other sound. Max stayed close to me, pacing anxiously as if sensing that something wasn't right, because it wasn't. Nothing had been right since I moved into this house. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen. I dialed Jake's number, and when he answered, I could hear the noise of his job, the clattering of doors and radios crackling in the background. "Hey babe, what's up?" he asked casually, completely unaware of the terror unraveling inside me. I hadn't told him about the weird things before, the noises, the tapping, or the figure in the backyard. I'd been scared he'd think I was being dramatic. But now I had to tell him everything. "Jake," I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. "There's something wrong with the house. There's someone here, or something. I don't know. I just found a note outside the door. I don't feel safe." The line went quiet for a second, then I heard him take a deep breath. "What? What do you mean? Are you sure it's not just some kid messing with you? Maybe it's the neighbors." "No, Jake," I snapped, my voice rising out of sheer panic. "This isn't a prank. There's something in the house. I hear things at night, tapping on the windows, whispers. Tonight, I got a note that said I've never been alone. I swear I saw someone in the backyard last night. I'm not imagining this." He went quiet again, and I could hear him shuffling around on the other end of the line. Okay, stay calm. I'm coming home now. I'll leave work early. Just stay inside, keep the doors locked, and stay on the phone with me until I get there." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Hearing that he was coming home helped, but only just. My fear still felt like it was crawling through my veins, seeping into every corner of my body. "Okay, I'm locking everything," I said, moving through the house, turning on every light, making sure every window was locked, pulling the curtains closed tighter. Max followed me, whining softly as we made our way through the rooms. When I reached the kitchen, something felt different. It was like the air had thickened, heavier somehow. The lights above the kitchen table flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. I froze, gripping the counter to steady myself as darkness swallowed the room. My phone's screen glowed faintly, but it wasn't enough to push back the thick shadows that seemed to creep closer. "Jake," I whispered into the phone, my voice trembling. "The lights went out. Something's wrong." "I'm almost there," he said, his voice tight with worry. "Just hold on." But as I stood there in the dark, the silence in the house shifted. It wasn't complete silence anymore. There was something else, something moving, a faint rustling sound. It was so soft at first, I thought it might have been the wind, but it was coming from inside, from upstairs. My blood turned to ice. Someone was upstairs. I backed away from the stairs, moving as quietly as I could, but Max let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the top of this case. My heart raced and I felt like I was suffocating. The rustling grew louder, like someone was shuffling across the floorboards above me. The phone slipped from my hand, clattering onto the kitchen floor. I scrambled to pick it up, but the screen had gone black. My fingers fumbled to unlock it, but my brain wasn't working right anymore, my panic clouding every thought. And then I heard it, a whisper. Not from the phone, not from outside, but from the hallway, just beyond the kitchen door. The voice was faint, almost delicate, like someone was trying to coax me into coming closer. "You've never been alone. We've always been here." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The air around me seemed to still, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. And then, from the dark hallway, a shadow moved. I only caught a glimpse, something tall, something hunched, its figure distorted by the darkness. But it was enough to send me into full panic. I grabbed Max by the collar, dragging him toward the front door. My heart was slamming against my ribs as I unlocked the door, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped the keys. As soon as the door swung open, I bolted out onto the front porch, Max following close behind, his tail tucked between his legs. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop running until I was standing at the edge of the driveway, staring back at the house. It looked so normal from the outside, quiet, peaceful, like nothing was wrong. But I knew better. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong since the moment we moved in. I stood there in the cold, clutching Max's collar, trying to catch my breath. My phone finally lit up with a call from Jake, and I answered immediately, my voice trembling as I told him what happened. "I'm pulling up now," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Stay where you are." Within minutes, Jake's car screeched into the driveway, and he jumped out, running toward me. The relief I felt at seeing him was almost overwhelming. I collapsed into his arms, shaking, trying to explain everything that had happened in those last few minutes. "We can't stay here," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Something's in the house. I don't know what it is, but we need to leave." Jake didn't argue. He helped me into the car, Max jumping in beside me, and we drove away from the house without looking back. I don't think either of us knew what to say. The fear that had been gnawing at me for days had finally burst out into the open, and there was no going back. We ended up staying at a hotel that night. Neither of us slept. We just sat there in silence, the weight of what had happened hanging heavy in the air. The next day, Jake insisted on going back to the house to check things out, but I couldn't bring myself to go with him. I stayed at the hotel with Max, waiting anxiously for him to call. When he finally did, his voice was quiet, almost disbelieving. "There's nothing here," he said. "The house is empty. No signs of anyone breaking in, nothing missing. Everything's exactly where we left it." I didn't know how to respond to that. How could everything be normal after what I'd seen, after what I'd heard? But then Jake paused. "Except, there's something strange. The attic door. It's open." My blood ran cold. "We don't even go up there," I whispered, my mind racing. "I know," Jake said, his voice tense, "but it's wide open, like someone's been living up there." He didn't say anything else, but I didn't need him to. I knew what he was thinking. Whatever, or whoever, had been in the house that night hadn't just left. They'd been there the whole time, hidden above us, watching, waiting, and I had no doubt they would return. I've thought about that night more times than I can count. And the more I think about it, the more it feels like a nightmare that I somehow haven't woken up from. Even now, when I try to explain what happened, it sounds ridiculous. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. And I know that it wasn't just in my head. Something was out there that night, and I'll never forget it. We'd been planning the camping trip for weeks. Just me, my friend Mike, and a couple of other friends. It was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway. Nothing fancy, just us guys, a few beers, and some time out in nature. We found this spot deep in the woods, far enough from civilization that you could see every star in the sky, but not so far that we felt completely isolated. It was perfect. The first night was exactly what we'd hoped for. We set up camp just before sunset, our tents forming a small circle around the fire pit. The woods around us were dense and quiet, the air crisp with that distinct smell of pine and damp earth. There was a slight chill in the air, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt good, actually, like the kind of cold that wakes you up, sharp and refreshing. We sat around the fire, talking, laughing, telling dumb stories, the usual. By the time we turned in, it was well past midnight. Mike and I shared a tent, and the others had their own setup nearby. As I zipped up the tent door and settled into my sleeping bag, I remember thinking about how peaceful it all felt. I've never been much of a camper, but there was something about the stillness of the woods that night that put me at ease. I must have fallen asleep pretty quickly, because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of Mike's voice. "Help me." It was a sharp, desperate shout, and it jolted me awake instantly. My heart was pounding in my chest as I sat up, my mind still groggy and confused. I blinked a few times, trying to shake the sleep from my eyes, and then I heard it again. "Help me!" It was Mike. His voice was coming from somewhere outside the tent, deeper in the woods. I panicked. Without even thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and scrambled to unzip the tent. My hands were shaking, and my mind raced with questions. Why was Mike out there? What was happening? Was he hurt? As soon as I got the tent open, I stepped outside and shone the flashlight around the campsite. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was no sign of Mike. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the area. The trees loomed tall and silent around me, their shadows stretching across the ground like long, dark fingers. "Mike?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Where are you?" No answer. The wind rustled through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. It was colder than I remembered, and my breath came out in little white puffs. I took a few steps away from the tent, listening for any sign of movement, but all I could hear was the distant rustling of leaves and the faint hoot of an owl somewhere far off. "Mike!" I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. That's when the fear really started to set in. Something was wrong. I could feel it deep in my gut, this gnawing sense that something wasn't right. I shone the flashlight toward Mike's side of the tent, half expecting to find it empty, but there he was, sleeping soundly, his body completely still under the sleeping bag. My heart nearly stopped. I stood there, frozen, staring at him. He hadn't moved. He was in the tent the whole time. But I know I heard his voice. I heard him shouting for help, clear as day. I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me, the kind that creeps into your bones and makes your skin prickle. I stepped back into the tent, my hand trembling as I pulled the zipper closed behind me. I sat there for a long moment, staring at Mike, my mind racing. My breathing was shallow, my pulse thudding in my ears. I couldn't make sense of it. How could I have heard him calling for help if he was right there, asleep? Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe I had imagined it. That's what I tried to tell myself anyway. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. It hadn't felt like a dream. It had felt real, too real. I lay back down in my sleeping bag, but I didn't close my eyes. I just stared up at the top of the tent, my ears straining for any sound, any hint of what I'd heard before. Every small noise outside the tent felt amplified, each rustle of leaves or crack of a twig sending my heart racing again. I wanted to wake Mike up to tell him what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It felt too ridiculous. What was I supposed to say? "Hey, I think I heard you calling for help from the woods, but you've been asleep the whole time." He'd think I was losing it, so I kept quiet, but I didn't sleep. A couple of hours passed. At least I think it was a couple of hours. It's hard to tell when you're lying there in the dark, your mind playing tricks on you. I must have dozed off at some point, though, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up again. This time it wasn't Mike's voice that woke me. It was something else. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. It was the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching through the leaves just outside the tent. My heart skipped a beat. I held my breath, listening intently, my entire body tense. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They were moving around the campsite, circling the tent. I glanced over at Mike, but he was still asleep, completely unaware of what was happening. The footsteps stopped suddenly, right outside the tent. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, in the stillness of the night, I heard it again, "Help me." It was Mike's voice, but it wasn't coming from inside the tent. It was coming from right outside. My blood turned to ice. I clamped my hand over my mouth, trying to stifle the panicked breath that threatened to escape. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that voice as possible, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. "Help me." The voice came again, soft but insistent. This time, there was something different about it, something off. It sounded like Mike, but it didn't feel like Mike. It was too calm, too measured, almost mechanical, like someone was trying to mimic his voice but didn't quite get it right. The footsteps resumed, moving around the tent again, slow and deliberate. I could hear the leaves crunching underfoot, the faint rustling of the trees as the wind picked up. But the voice, it stayed the same. Calm, even, too calm for someone calling for help. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped again. The silence was so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the tent. I lay there, frozen, listening, waiting. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them good. And then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. "It knows you're awake, Hold." The voice wasn't Mike's anymore. It wasn't even close. It was something else, something darker, more sinister. It was quiet, barely audible, but it sent a wave of terror through me that I'd never felt before. It wasn't just a whisper. It felt like a presence, something pressing in on me, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but I couldn't. My voice was stuck in my throat, my body frozen in place. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that if I didn't acknowledge it, it would go away. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. I knew whatever was out there wasn't going to leave. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. I couldn't tell. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the darkness. The footsteps never returned, but the silence was worse. The silence was unbearable. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me. I don't know how, but I must have fallen asleep again, because when I woke up, it was morning. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and everything seemed perfectly normal. But the moment I opened my eyes, the events of the night before came flooding back. I sat up quickly, glancing over at Mike. He was already awake, sitting up in his sleeping bag, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "You okay, man?" he asked, noticing the look on my face. I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to tell him everything, but I couldn't find the words. How was I supposed to explain what had happened? How was I supposed to make sense of it when it didn't make any sense? "Yeah," I finally muttered. "Rough night." Mike didn't press me. He just nodded, stretching as he got out of the tent. The others were already up, gathering around the fire pit, getting ready to make breakfast. I stepped out of the tent, squinting in the bright sunlight. The campsite looked exactly as we'd left it, peaceful, normal. But as I stood there, staring out into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting. And then I saw it. There, just at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall, hunched, its body twisted in a way that didn't seem natural. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but I knew it was looking at me. And I knew, without a doubt, that it had been there the whole night. I blinked, and it was gone. I never told Mike or the others about what happened that night. I couldn't. They wouldn't have believed me. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. Something was out there. Something that wasn't human. And it had used Mike's voice to lure me out. I've tried so many times to forget that night. I keep telling myself that it was just a trick of the mind, that maybe I was half asleep, or maybe the wind played strange games with the sounds in the forest. But no matter how much I try to rationalize it, there's this part of me deep down that knows the truth. Something was out there, and it wasn't finished with me. After that night, everything felt different. The trip ended without any more strange incidents, at least nothing I could see or hear. The others were none the wiser, laughing and joking around the campfire the next morning, like it was just another weekend in the woods. They had no idea that I was barely holding it together, pretending that everything was normal, while every fiber of my being screamed to get out of there. I couldn't tell them. How could I? It wasn't like I could explain to them what I had heard, what I felt. That terrible sense of being watched, the cold, creeping dread that clung to me like a shadow. They'd just brush it off as a bad dream, laugh it away like I was overreacting. And a part of me wanted to believe that maybe I was. But when I saw that figure, when I locked eyes with whatever was standing at the edge of the woods, I knew it wasn't a dream. It was real as the ground beneath my feet. The worst part, though, came after we packed up and left. We didn't talk much on the drive back. Mike sat next to me in the passenger seat, dozing off as I gripped the steering wheel, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. I kept expecting to see that figure again, standing at the side of the road, watching as we sped away from the forest. I don't know why, but I had this nagging sense that it had followed me, that it wanted me to know it wasn't done. For a while, things were quiet once we got home. A week went by, then two. Life went back to normal, or at least it was supposed to. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, jumping at small noises in my apartment that never used to bother me before. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, it all felt too loud, too intrusive, like it didn't belong in my space anymore. And then it started again. The first time I heard the voice, I thought I was losing my mind. I had just gotten home from work, late, around midnight. Mike had called me earlier, asking if I wanted to grab drinks, but I'd made an excuse. I didn't feel like going out. I hadn't seen him much since the trip, and every time I thought about spending time with him, I felt this weird sense of unease. I couldn't explain it, but after what happened in the woods, I just didn't feel comfortable being around him anymore. Maybe it was guilt for not telling him, or maybe it was something else, something darker. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, trying to relax after a long day, when I heard it. Help me. My blood ran cold. It was faint, almost a whisper, but I heard it, clear as day. It was Mike's voice. I froze, my hand trembling as I held the phone. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, but I couldn't ignore it. I had heard him. The same voice, the same tone as that night in the woods. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, and moved toward the door. I half expected to see Mike standing in the hallway, maybe playing some kind of twisted joke on me. But when I opened the door and peered out into the dimly lit corridor, there was nothing. "Mike," I called out, my voice shaking. I knew it was stupid. Mike wasn't there, but the sound of his voice still echoed in my ears. Silence. The hallway was empty, just the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. I slammed the door shut, locking it quickly. My heart was racing, my hands clammy with sweat. I sat back down on the couch, trying to convince myself it was just in my head. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe the stress of that night had finally caught up with me, and I was hearing things that weren't really there. That had to be it. But deep down, I knew better. The next few nights, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing it. Mike's voice, calling out to me from the darkness. Sometimes it was faint, like a whisper right behind my ear. Other times it sounded distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away, but always just close enough to hear. The voice followed me through the apartment, haunting me no matter what I did. I stopped answering Mike's calls. I couldn't face him. Every time I saw his name flash on my phone screen, my heart would start racing, and the memories of that night in the woods would come flooding back. It wasn't just fear. It was something more than that. Something darker, something deeper. And then the dreams started. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the vivid image of that figure at the edge of the woods burned into my mind. In the dream, I was back at the campsite, alone this time, standing in front of the tent. The fire was gone, and the woods were deathly silent. And then, without warning, the footsteps would start again, slow and deliberate, circling around me, just like they had that night. I would stand there, frozen in place, unable to move, my heart pounding in my chest, and then the voice would come. Help me. It wasn't Mike's voice anymore. It was something else, something wrong. In the dream, I would turn to face the woods, and that's when I would see it, the figure. But this time, it was closer. I could see it more clearly now, and I wished to God I hadn't. Its body was twisted and hunched, its skin a sickly, pale gray, and its face, there was something about its face that made my stomach turn. It looked almost human, but not quite. Its eyes were too large, its mouth too wide, like it was stretched over something unnatural, and it was smiling at me. That smile, it was the worst part. It wasn't a normal smile. It was the kind of smile that said it knew me, that it had been watching me for a long time, and that it wasn't going anywhere. I would wake up screaming every time. And then one night, I made the mistake of answering Mike's call. It had been about a month since the camping trip, and I'd been avoiding him ever since. But when the phone rang that night, something inside me told me to pick up. Maybe it was the guilt, or maybe I just needed to hear his voice, to make sure he was okay. I pressed the phone to my ear, my hand shaking. "Hey man, where have you been?" Mike's voice was light, casual, like nothing had happened, like he had no idea what I'd been going through. "Mike," I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "I'm sorry I haven't been in touch. I don't know, man. Things have been weird lately." "Yeah? Weird how?" I swallowed hard. glancing around the apartment as if the walls themselves were listening. I don't know how to explain it. I've been hearing things, seeing things. It's hard to describe, but ever since that night in the woods, I've felt like something's been following me. Mike went quiet on the other end of the line. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd lost the connection. But then I heard him laugh, a soft, almost mocking laugh. "You don't get it, do you?" His voice was different now, darker, colder, my stomach twisted. What are you talking about? "You think it followed you home?" he said, his voice low and menacing. "No, man." I froze, my blood turning to ice, and then I heard it, that voice clear as day, coming from the phone, but also from the hallway outside my apartment. "Help me." It all started with a phone call. It was late, probably around 11:30 p.m., and I was just settling into bed, exhausted after a long day at work. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen lighting up in the dim room. I frowned. Who calls this late? The number was unknown, but for whatever reason, I answered it. Maybe it was a mistake, but something in the back of my mind convinced me it could be important. "Hello?" I said, my voice groggy with sleep. There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then a voice, cold, sharp, and full of restrained anger, spoke. "I know what you've done." I sat up, the drowsiness fading instantly as a wave of unease crept over me. "I'm sorry." "What?" I replied, confusion clear in my voice. "You've ruined my life, you and your lies." Her words cut through the quiet like a knife. I didn't recognize the voice, but there was an intensity behind it that sent chills down my spine. She sounded like someone who had been waiting for this moment, someone who had rehearsed what she was going to say. "Who is this?" I asked, my heart beginning to race. "You know exactly who this is," she hissed. "My name is Emily, and because of you, my husband, he hates me." I blinked, trying to piece together what was happening. Emily? Husband? I didn't know any Emily, and I certainly wasn't involved with anyone's husband. "You've got the wrong person," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, don't play dumb," Emily snapped. "You think I don't know what's been going on? I've seen the messages. I've seen how you've been trying to steal him away." I was speechless. Messages? Steal her husband away? This had to be a prank, right? But the anger in her voice, it didn't feel like a prank. It felt real, raw. "I think you have the wrong number," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't even know who you are, let alone your husband." There was a pause on the other end, but the silence was more unnerving than the yelling. When she finally spoke again, her voice was low, venomous. "You're a liar, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows what kind of person you are." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at my phone, the screen now dark, the room around me eerily quiet. My pulse was racing, my mind spinning. Who the hell was Emily, and why did she think I was involved with her husband? For a few moments I sat there in disbelief, wondering if this was some bizarre mistake. Maybe it was a case of wrong identity, or maybe someone was messing with her, feeding her lies. But the way she spoke, it wasn't just anger, it was obsession. I didn't sleep well that night. I tossed and turned, replaying the conversation in my head, trying to convince myself it was just a fluke. Maybe she'd realize her mistake and leave me alone. But it didn't stop there. The next morning I woke up to find dozens of notifications on my phone. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, everywhere. There were comments and messages from someone named Emily H. At first, they seemed innocent enough, like someone trying to get my attention, but as I scrolled through the notifications, the messages became more aggressive. "How could you do this to me? Homewrecker. You think you can just steal someone's husband and get away with it?" Each message was more intense than the last, and all of them were public. She had posted on my photos, commented on old statuses, even tagged me in her own posts, accusing me of being some kind of mistress. My heart pounded as I stared at the flood of messages. This woman, whoever she was, wasn't just angry. She was trying to destroy me. I spent hours that morning going through my accounts, blocking her, deleting her comments, but it didn't stop. She would create new accounts, slightly different variations of the same username, and continue the harassment. Every time I thought I had gotten rid of her, she'd pop back up. I started to feel trapped. No matter what I did, she wouldn't go away. And the things she said, it wasn't just angry rants anymore. It was personal. She knew things about me. She mentioned places I'd been, people I knew. It was like she had been following me, watching my life unfold from the shadows. I tried to explain what was happening to my friends, but even as I told them, I felt ridiculous. How do you explain that a complete stranger has decided to ruin your life because of some imagined affair? They were sympathetic, sure, but they didn't understand the fear that was creeping in. They thought it was just a crazy person on the internet, someone who would eventually get bored and move on. But I knew it wasn't that simple. A week later, she called me again. This time, it wasn't late at night, but the moment I saw the unknown number, I knew it was her. I didn't want to answer, but something in me, maybe morbid curiosity, forced me to pick up. "I'm not going to let you destroy my marriage," Emily said before I even had a chance to speak. "Emily," I said, my voice shaking, "I don't know who you are, but you need to stop. I don't know your husband. I don't even know you." "Liar," she spat. "I've seen the texts. I've seen the photos. You can't hide from this." I felt the blood drain from my face. Texts, photos. What the hell was she talking about? "I swear to you, I don't know what you're talking about. You have the wrong person." There was a pause, and for a moment I thought she might actually be listening. But then she let out this soft, eerie laugh. "You're good at this. You really are. But you can't fool me. I'm going to expose you." And just like that, the call ended again. I sat there, staring at the phone, my hands trembling. It wasn't just the harassment anymore. She was fixated on me. I could feel it, this deep, unsettling sense that Emily was spiraling and I was somehow at the center of it. A part of me wanted to go to the police, but what would I say? It's not like she had physically threatened me, and online harassment cases don't get much attention unless they escalate into something serious. Besides, I didn't even know where she lived or who she really was. She was just a voice on the phone, a name on fake accounts. But then things started getting worse. Over the next few days, I noticed strange things happening. Packages I didn't order showed up at my door. Flowers, random food deliveries, all addressed to Emily. At first, I thought it was some kind of mix-up, but then I started getting phone calls from businesses. They asked me to confirm my appointments I had never made. Spa visits, dentist checkups, even a consultation with a lawyer. Each time I told them I hadn't made the appointment, they apologized and said the request came from a woman named Emily H. I was losing it. I felt like she was invading every aspect of my life, like she was always one step ahead, always watching. I stopped going on social media, terrified of what new account she might create next. I barely left the house, too anxious that she might be lurking somewhere nearby. I kept wondering, who is this woman? How does she know so much about me? That's when I decided I had to meet her. It wasn't hard to track her down, surprisingly. She had tagged me in enough posts that I could find her real name, her real Facebook account, even the town she lived in. I figured that if I could just talk to her in person, explain that there was some huge misunderstanding, maybe I could end this nightmare. I drove 2 hours to her town, my stomach in knots the entire way. I had no idea what I was walking into, but I couldn't keep living in fear of this woman. When I pulled up to her house, a modest suburban home with a neatly trimmed lawn, it felt surreal. I half expected her to come storming out, yelling at me, demanding to know why I was there. But instead, the door opened, and a woman stepped out onto the porch. It was her, Emily. But she wasn't what I expected. She looked normal, average. Her expression was calm, even friendly, as she walked toward me. There was no trace of the fury I'd heard in her voice, no sign of the woman who had been tormenting me for weeks. "Hi, can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft, polite. I blinked, confused. "Emily?" She smiled, nodding. "Yes, that's me." I stood there, frozen, staring at her. This was the woman who had been sending me hate-filled messages? The woman who had threatened to ruin my life? I'm the person you've been messaging," I stammered, still trying to process the situation. Emily's brow furrowed. "Messaging? I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about." My heart raced. This didn't make sense. How could she not know?